Team from the International Monetary Fund has wrapped up its visit to the country without reaching an agreement on how exactly the fund could support the government's economic reform program. This development leaves the authorities in Addis Ababa short of a commitment that it made with its official bilateral creditors, excluding China. The Paris Club of Creditors, which doesn't include China, said last year in November that an agreement to suspend Ethiopia's debt service payments through to 2025 could be voided if the country didn't have a staff-level agreement on an IMF credit line by the 31st of March. At the moment, though, it's not 100% clear if the Paris Club members will actually enforce that deadline. Ethiopia reached a separate debt service suspension deal with China earlier in 2023. In December, Ethiopia became the third African nation to default in as many years in December after it failed to make a $33 million coupon payment on its $1 billion Eurobond, which is due at the end of this year. Right, then a bit of analysis on this story. Gabriel Negatu is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. He's joining us now live on the program. Thank you for your time this evening, Mr. Negatu. So the statement from the IMF that came out yesterday was very brief, and he just said, look, talks are in progress and it will continue at the spring meetings in about 2 weeks' time. Do you think that Ethiopia's gotten the extra time that it needs to wrap up this staff-level agreement from the bilateral creditors?
Good. Thank you. Thank you for having me on. I think the exchange with the IMF has been going on in earnest for a good part of 2 weeks, and some progress has been made, but clearly they were not able to conclude. So what has happened is they've agreed they will continue this in about 15 days in Washington when the World Bank IMF annual spring meetings will take place. So in the meantime, I'm reliably informed that Ethiopia has requested an extension of the March 31st deadline set by the G20 debt framework group, so perhaps except China. So that discussion will continue in Washington, and I want to believe there will be an extension granted towards that effect.
In other comparable situations, and I have Egypt in mind here, a key sticking point often becomes the willingness or not to liberalize the currency. And I know that's been a sticking point. That's something that the Ethiopian authorities have discussed with the IMF with respect to the birr several times in the past. Do you think that's the exact same main issue that the two sides are probably not agreeing on?
Well, the currency surely is one of the key issues. And I believe they've reached consensus on the need for some form of devaluation. We may not know the exact level of devaluation and whether it will be pegged or whether it will be a band, and so on. But there seems to be a meeting of minds around the issue of devaluation. My thinking and my information say that the more difficult issue still on the table is the issue of deficit financing. As you know, the government of Ethiopia runs a deficit, budget deficit, and the IMF seems to have its own ideas about how this deficit should be financed. Normally, as you know, deficit is funded either through taxes, borrowing, or the issuance of bonds. And of course, the easiest one is always to borrow from the central bank, and the IMF is not too happy with that. So they are still in discussion about the ways and means of financing the deficit without necessarily increasing the inflation and allowing for wasteful government spending and slowing down investment. So how the deficit gets financed without destabilizing the rest of the economy seems to be where the discussion is still going on.
As far as you know, how much cash are we looking at here in terms of what Ethiopia would need to not just rebuild its foreign currency reserves, but also at the same time, have a level of comfort that would essentially allow the National Bank of Ethiopia to, let the birr to essentially devalue by, say, 20 or 30%?
Well, what we know and what's been floated is this idea of a $3.5 billion injection of new and additional funds into the Ethiopian economy from the IMF, an IMF loan, either from standby facility or one of the facilities, for a $3.5 billion loan. And what is being negotiated at this point is out of the $27-28 billion loan that Ethiopia currently owns. I think we're looking at getting a reprieve on about 20 billion of that. So once the agreement is reached, then the expectation is that the IMF will now raise and make available about 3.5 plus dollars into the Ethiopian economy in the form of a debt.
All right, and so just to be clear, Ethiopia's got about $27.8 billion in external debt. You're saying roughly 20 billion of that is essentially what will have to be restructured. So what are we looking at in that sense? Are we looking at maturity extensions, or are we looking at reprofiling the facilities?
Well, most likely maturity extension for sure. And then this issue of the equitable treatment of all lenders will now see whether there's going to be a haircut amongst the different lenders and so on. But at least at a minimum, it will require a maturity extension by 12 months or more. And then during that period, this equitable treatment principle will kick in, and we'll see how the debtors will be treated amongst themselves. So that is something to watch for.